Over the last 2 years, the wealthiest 5% of families have seen their disposable incomes rise by £3,300 a year, according to a new study from the New Economics Foundation. Half of UK families have seen their disposable income shrink. The poorest 50% of households, meanwhile, have seen their incomes squeezed, becoming £110 poorer. There's a clear pattern here. Many high earners in white-collar jobs, often in London and the South East, have done pretty well out of lockdown, thank you, carrying on their jobs from home while saving money on commuting. Hence the rise in their disposable income once they've paid all their expenses. By contrast, many working in sectors that have suffered most during lockdown, hospitality, tourism and so on, are already relatively poor and perhaps work in the so-called gig economy. So they've lost out on work without qualifying for furlough payments. The New Economic Foundation calculates there are now around 300,000 more families in poverty than there were in early 2019. The gap in incomes across regions has also widened in the last 2 years, with so-called red wall constituencies, those former Labour strongholds that are supposed to benefit from the government's levelling up agenda, the worst hit. Now, the government spent at least £200 billion on COVID support measures, an enormous sum. Yet, according to this new report, even with extensive furlough measures, business support loans and all the rest of it, inequalities still become more acute during this pandemic, with the UK's poorest regions suffering most. So as the government considers new anti-COVID measures, perhaps even renewed lockdown, that's your on-the-money question today. Could anti-COVID measures derail the government's levelling up agenda? Let's go first to you, Alfie. It is a pretty powerful report, I thought, quite eye-catching, particularly now. That's why we've based our show on it today. What really strikes you from this study from the New Economic Foundation?
No, I think you're right. I think that the figures speak for themselves and are striking. And clearly, those headline numbers, a £3,300 increase in incomes for the very richest 5%, compared with right across the board for the lower 50% of income families. They've actually been squeezed, and they've been squeezed between about £30 a year right up to £260 a year, and an average of 110. So a widening of inequality, not just maintaining existing inequalities, but widening. And even within that top half, the richest getting richer 8 times faster than the rest in the top half. So it all over the distribution. Everything's going in the wrong direction. And across regions, the really stark increase in incomes in London, even the very poorest in London, in fact, have seen an increase in their incomes, whereas right across the board, the poorest have lost income in the rest of the country. And on average, incomes have grown 6 times less fast across the north of England, the West Midlands, than in London. So these figures speak for themselves. And I think, widening of inequality is an indictment on any government, but for one where levelling up has been put at the heart of their political and policy agenda, it really is hugely damaging for a government that's committed itself to that to that agenda.
What would you say to the government if you had 30 seconds in an elevator with Boris Johnson? It may be that we're going to have renewed anti-COVID restrictions. There's clearly a live debate going on, not least in the House of Commons. But if there are new restrictions coming in, what should we do differently this time to support low-income households that we didn't do last time?
So I think Helen's completely spot on. The answer isn't to put in place COVID restrictions. If you let the virus run riot, it will have also devastating consequences, not only for public health, but also livelihoods. And that will hit a gradient of existing inequalities and be worse outside of London than in London. But I would say the key message is, when you're thinking about your policy design, don't think about policies that just protect the status quo, i.e. shield the current economy from the pandemic, because you're just preserving existing inequalities. And in fact, in the case of the last 12 months, making them worse because of clear gaps in terms of those out of work, those are self-employed. So think actively about how your protection policies take you on an agenda towards actually delivering levelling up. So that's more support for those out of work, more support for those in the regions outside London and the South East, and getting to families directly, which is perhaps better sometimes than going via businesses.
Alfie Stirling, going back to you, Helen, as I said, mentioned housing. Is that something that the New Economic Foundation wants to see? More social housing being built, what we once called council houses, that is low housing, subsidised rents for lower income and otherwise vulnerable households, a form of housing that's barely been built in recent years.
No, I think that's completely right. I think when you're trying to address cost of living, you need to look at two underlying drivers. One is how much cash do people have at their disposal to buy the things they need? And the other is what is the cost of the key things in life and what can government do to reduce those costs? Clearly on housing, a system where you just transfer money via renters to landlords to prop up a dysfunctional system is not the answer. It needs to be a better social housing offer. Private sector and public sector have a role to play in this, and the planning bill going through Parliament at the moment is an opportunity to do that. But I do want to take us back to this point about that underlying cash safety net as well, because I think to really simplify all of this, part of the problem during COVID was government tried to address problems with entirely new schemes like furlough, like the self-employed income protection scheme, because our existing safety net was so weak. I mean, at the moment, the basic unemployment payment is about 17% of average earnings. It's the weakest in our own history, and it's also the third or fourth worst among 38 advanced economies. So our basic safety net is not fit for purpose. And rather than creating entirely new schemes, you could do a lot by just restoring that. I mean, if you look at families on universal credit, on average, they've got about 50, 60% of the income they need to meet the very basic minimum needs. They're well short. And so by investing in UCs, it's partly about £20 uplift. It's also things like, at the moment, families having inflation bite into their spending power because benefits are only operated from September inflation, yet we've seen this winter a big increase. But it's also about really meaningfully lifting up that income floor. So it's a trampoline for people, not a poverty trap. And it allows people to then bounce back off it into the labour market or to look after loved ones or whatever it is they need to do with support from society at large.